He was a king who married 6 wives, broke away from the Pope, and left behind a dynasty drenched in blood, betrayal and power. This is the story of Henry VIII, the most feared and fascinating monarch in English history. Born in grandeur, ruled by desire and remembered for his iron will, Henry VIII changed not just England, but the course of world history forever. Tonight, we take you into his world, where love meant danger and power meant survival. Henry Tudor, who would one day become King Henry VIII of England, was not born to inherit the crown. He entered the world on June 28, 1491, at Greenwich Palace, the second son of King Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. From the beginning, the boy grew up in the shadow of his elder brother, Prince Arthur, who held the destiny of England on his shoulders as the heir apparent. Henry was the spare, important, royal and privileged, but not central to the future of the dynasty. Henry VII, Henry's father, was the first Tudor king. He had won his crown by force at the Battle of Bosworth in 1485, ending the Wars of the Roses between Lancaster and York. His reign was one of restoration, healing, and the careful securing of power. Every move was made to legitimize the fragile Tudor dynasty. As king, Henry VII was cautious, disciplined, and often suspicious, determined to keep England stable after decades of civil war. His children, especially the princes Arthur and Henry, were raised not just as boys of privilege but as political treasures who would secure the Tudor legacy. From an early age, Prince Henry was different from his reserved father. Where Henry VII was quiet, watchful and frugal, young Henry was energetic, loud and confident. He was attractive even as a child, with reddish-gold hair, fair skin and a lively athletic build. His personality would quickly shine through court life, making him a favourite of those who encountered him, even if he was the second son. Like many royal children of the Renaissance era, Henry's education was broad and rigorous. He showed a natural talent for languages, theology and the arts. Tutors instructed him in Latin, history, poetry, mathematics and religious studies. He was also trained in music and became an accomplished musician. Records tell us that he could sing, play the lute, the organ, and even compose pieces of music himself. This love for culture and refinement stayed with him throughout life. But Henry was never just a scholar. He had been given the body of an athlete, tall for his age and filled with energy. He excelled in jousting, archery, wrestling and hunting, pastimes loved by nobles and admired at court. As a boy, he rode horses fearlessly and displayed an enthusiasm for sport that earned him much admiration. Where Arthur was delicate and serious, Henry was robust and vibrant, a boy who represented health, strength, and the hope of future glory. It is worth remembering that at this stage nobody expected Prince Henry to become king. His destiny was that of a supporting figure, perhaps one day a duke, a nobleman, or a leading churchman. This gave him more freedom, less pressure than his brother Arthur, and allowed his natural charisma to develop. Henry could afford to be flamboyant, sociable and bold because the weight of kingship rested elsewhere. Henry's elder brother Arthur bore the responsibility of Tudor survival. Arthur was the Prince of Wales, groomed carefully as the future king. He was quiet, devout and studious, admired for his intelligence and seriousness, but frailer in health than many would have liked. He was Prince Henry's opposite in many ways. Arthur represented duty, Henry represented youthful energy. Though brothers, their futures were drawn along different lines. Arthur was trained to rule, Henry was trained to serve and support. This division shaped Henry's character. It allowed him to enjoy a freer, less burdened upbringing, while Arthur shouldered the strain of expectation. Despite that difference, the bond between the two mattered deeply to the family. Both boys were meant to play roles in the security of Tudor power. Each needed to ensure that England had heirs, alliances and continuity. A key event in their youth came with Arthur's marriage. In 1501, at the age of 15, Arthur was married to Catherine of Aragon, daughter of the powerful Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. This union was not just about love, it was a strategic alliance to tie England to one of the strongest kingdoms in Europe. The young Henry, barely 10 years old, took part in the ceremonies, playing his role as the prince who would one day support his brother's reign. Arthur and Catherine were sent to live at Ludlow Castle in the Welsh Marches to begin their married life together. But before long, tragedy struck. In April 1502, Arthur, not yet 16 years old, fell gravely ill and died. His death shocked the court and threw the Tudor dynasty into fear. Suddenly, the entire burden of succession fell on the young Henry, who was only 11 years old at the time. In the space of a single moment, he was no longer the spare, he was England's future king. Arthur's death changed Henry's life forever. Until that point, his childhood had been filled with ease, education, hunting, and joy. He could show off his skills, charm the court, and live without the heavy crown weighting over his head. Now, everything shifted. From the moment his brother died, the boy was groomed for kingship. His parents, Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, treated him with a new seriousness. He became the focus of dynastic hopes, though he was still young. The loss of Elizabeth of York in 1503, just a year later, further darkened the household. Henry's mother had been a softening influence at court, providing warmth and balance to her husband's cautious rule. Without her, and after Arthur's death, young Henry grew in an atmosphere dominated by his father's strict control and obsession with security. Henry VII was not fond of exposing his new heir to danger. Because the king himself had risen through uncertainty and fear, he guarded Henry carefully, almost to the point of suffocation. The boy was not allowed major responsibilities or public roles as a teenager. Instead, he spent his youth being polished, drilled, and observed. He was kept safe, sometimes too safe, as Henry VII feared losing his last surviving male heir. Though restricted by his father, Henry found outlets for his energy. Court entertainments, games, and studies gave him space to grow. The mismatch between his exuberant personality and his father's controlled, severe style planted seeds of frustration. Prince Henry dreamed of freedom, adventure, and glory, while his father insisted on caution and careful rule. These tensions would later explode when Henry became king himself and ruled in a dramatically different way from his father. Even in these early years, Henry showed signs of what he would later become: ambitious, proud, and eager to leave his mark. He watched court politics unfold, observed alliances shift, and saw how fragile royal power could be. He absorbed lessons in kingship from one of the most cautious rulers in English history. But inside him burned a different vision, one filled with grandeur and action, not restraint. By 1509, when Henry VII died, the boy who grew up as the spare was now ready to govern an entire kingdom. But before that coronation, his childhood had already laid the foundation of two men, a charming, brilliant prince loved by many, and a determined heir who longed to break free from his father's shadow. When Henry VII died on April 21st, 1509, England's future shifted onto the shoulders of his 17-year-old son, Prince Henry. The boy who had never been expected to wear the crown was suddenly King Henry VIII of England. The court, the nobility, and the ordinary people all turned their eyes toward the young monarch with excitement and hope. After the years of Henry VII's cautious, penny-pinching rule, the country longed for a king who would dazzle them, lift their spirits, and lead them into a new age. Henry VIII seemed to embody everything a golden Renaissance prince should be. At the moment of his succession, he was tall, athletic, handsome, and full of vitality. His auburn hair, broad shoulders, and striking appearance drew admiration wherever he went. At 6 feet 2 inches tall, he towered over most men of his era. He was not only a king in name, but looked every bit a figure of majesty and physical strength. His youth brought fresh energy into the monarchy. The court, previously restrained and severe under his father, was suddenly filled with music, dancing, tournaments, and ceremony. Henry VIII loved to display wealth and splendour. He transformed the austere Tudor court into a place of bright extravagance, echoing the Renaissance ideals flourishing in Italy. For the first time in years, the people of England felt that their king was not just a ruler, but a symbol of hope. One of Henry's first actions as king was to confirm his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. She was the widow of his late brother Arthur. Their marriage had been arranged after Arthur's death, first discussed during Henry VII's rule but delayed by politics and disputes with Spain. When Henry VIII became king, he quickly chose to make Catherine his queen consort. Catherine was the daughter of Ferdinand II of Aragon and Isabella I of Castile, the monarchs who had united Spain and sponsored voyages that changed the world, including that of Christopher Columbus. By marrying her, Henry VIII strengthened ties with one of the most powerful royal families in Europe. The union symbolised continuity, linking his short line of Tudors to the respected dynasty of Spain. Their marriage began with warmth. Henry and Catherine appeared publicly as a young, affectionate royal couple. Their coronation together in June 1509 was celebrated with great enthusiasm. England welcomed them as symbols of renewal, the strong prince and his noble Spanish bride. Early impressions of Henry VIII were dazzling. He was charismatic, witty, generous, and approachable. Unlike the guarded nature of his father, Henry embraced public appearances and cultivated the image of a heroic king. He spent lavishly on festivals, jousting, banquets, and pageantry. He loved being admired, and admiration poured in. The king enjoyed more than entertainment. He was deeply interested in theology, music, and humanist learning. Henry surrounded himself with scholars, poets, and artists. He invited continental thinkers into his circle and strengthened England's place within the new culture of the Renaissance. He played instruments and composed songs, acted in court plays, and demonstrated broad intelligence that left many impressed. In tournaments, he rode at the lists in glittering armour, showing ferocity and grace. His powerful frame, combined with charm and showmanship, made him a natural leader in contests and ceremonies. He wanted always to be seen as the perfect model of kingship, strong in body, wise in counsel, and devoted in spirit. The opening years of Henry's reign brought optimism. Many nobles who had felt restrained under his father welcomed the livelier court. Henry VIII reversed several of his father's unpopular policies, ordering the execution of two of his father's most disliked financial advisers, Empson and Dudley, almost immediately. By doing so, the young king distanced himself from the severity of Henry VII and won popularity among the nobles. England, under its new king, looked like it was entering an era of glory. There had been peace and stability under Henry VII's careful watch, but the people were ready for action. They longed for a monarch who would raise England's prestige abroad, assert its strength in Europe, and embody national pride. In Henry VIII, they believed they had found just that. The court became a theatre of magnificence. Costly feasts with hundreds of dishes, masks with elaborate costumes, and constant tournaments showed the world a monarch who wanted England to shine. Ambassadors from foreign courts described Henry as the finest prince of his age, a ruler admired for his energy and grandeur. At the same time, Henry VIII delighted in his role as defender of the realm and of Christendom. A devout Catholic in his youth, he saw himself as a protector of the faith. His personal piety, alongside his public celebrations of culture and chivalry, seemed to complete the image of a Renaissance monarch blessed by God. From the start, Henry VIII dreamed of more than just being a successful ruler. He dreamed of being a conqueror, a warrior celebrated like the kings of old. He wanted to revive English glory in war, much as Henry V had achieved a century earlier at Agincourt. Behind the pageantry and festivities was a restless ambition. Catherine of Aragon, raised as a Spanish princess, encouraged this spirit. She had seen military glory in her parents' campaigns and victories. Together, Henry and Catherine imagined England as a power that could compete with France and Spain on the European stage. For the first time in years, England's future looked not just stable, but filled with expansionist promise. It was in these first years that Henry gained his title as the Golden King. The phrase captured not only his youthful brilliance, but the dreams he inspired. The people expected an age of prosperity, victory, and lasting strength. The early reign of Henry VIII was marked by optimism and hope. Nobody could predict the tempest that would eventually erupt around his marriages, his wars, and his religious revolution. For now, England had a young monarch bursting with energy, surrounded by admiration, stepping forward with the image of perfection. But beneath the admiration of the early years was already a spark of restlessness. Henry VIII did not want to be just another steady ruler. He wanted to be remembered among the greatest kings of history. That desire, the thirst not just for stability but for glory and immortality, would soon drive him down paths that would dramatically reshape England, the monarchy, and even religion itself. When Henry VIII took the throne, he inherited not only his father's crown but also his father's legacy of caution and stability. But Henry was not a man to be cautious. From his earliest days as king, he longed for something more, glory. He wanted to be remembered, not simply as a ruler who maintained the peace, but as a warrior, a conqueror and a hero of legend. This desire would soon shape the character of his reign. Unlike Henry VII, whose mind was always on finance and order, Henry VIII dreamed of prestige and honour. He looked across Europe to his rivals in France and Spain and believed England deserved a place among the great powers. Henry wanted wars, victories and achievements that would make the Tudor name shine for centuries. In his vision of kingship, Henry VIII often looked back to the medieval past. He admired kings like Henry V, who had won immortal fame at the Battle of Agincourt against France. To Henry VIII, a great king was one who fought wars, expanded territory, and commanded respect on the battlefield. Peace and caution might preserve stability, but they did not bring glory. At court, Henry often dressed in shining armour, took part in jousts, and thrilled the spectators with his physical strength. He wanted to be seen as a chivalric knight king, just as dazzling on horseback as he was on the throne. His love for tournaments was more than entertainment. It was a performance of the heroic image he wanted all of Europe to see. As Henry VIII began his reign, the balance of power in Europe was shifting. France was the traditional rival of England, a powerful kingdom under King Louis XII and later King Francis I. Scotland, to England's north, was tied in alliance with France, creating a double threat to England's security. Across the Channel, Spain, home to Catherine of Aragon's family, was also vying for influence. Meanwhile, the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor represented another set of forces that dominated European politics. Henry VIII wanted England on the map as a decisive player in this world rivalry. Almost immediately he set his sights on France, seeing war as a chance to replicate the glory of Henry V. Battles abroad would prove his strength and give him the honour he craved. At the same time, Scotland loomed as an enemy that could strike if Henry focused his armies across the Channel. The old alliance between Scotland and France meant that conflict with one often drew conflict with the other. For Henry, this was both a danger and an opportunity, two chances to show his might and earn renown. To turn ambition into action, Henry needed skilled administrators. One man rose above all others in these years, Thomas Wolsey. Originally the son of a butcher, Wolsey had climbed his way through education and church service to become one of the most influential men in England. His intelligence, charisma, and organisational skill earned Henry's trust, and soon Wolsey became Lord Chancellor and Chief Adviser. Wolsey managed the details that Henry hated. While Henry dreamed of war, Wolsey raised the money, organised armies, and negotiated alliances. Their partnership gave Henry the freedom to focus on what he loved, the tournaments, the glory, and the symbolism, while Wolsey handled the reality of politics, strategy, and finance. It was Wolsey who brought England into the wars against France, negotiated with other European powers, and tried to construct a web of alliances that would turn Henry's dreams into reality. To English nobles, Henry embodied the glory of action, while Wolsey was the master strategist making it possible. Henry's first campaigns against France began in 1512 and 1513. They were not grand invasions, but they did bring victories that could be celebrated. English forces captured the French towns of Tournai and Terouanne at the Battle of the Spurs in 1513, then Henry's troops scattered the French cavalry, earning the battle its mocking name, but Henry proudly presented it as a triumph. These victories were limited in real power, but they gave Henry the chance to display himself as a new warrior king. He wore armour, rode out with his lords, and received public acclaim. For Henry, the details mattered less than the image. He returned home with captured territory, symbolic victories, and the pride of being seen as England's champion. While Henry focused on France, Scotland struck from the north. In 1513, King James IV of Scotland, allied with France, invaded England. Henry himself was in France at the time, but his queen, Catherine of Aragon, played a vital role in rallying English forces. The armies clashed at the Battle of Flodden on September 9th, 1513. The result was a crushing English victory. King James IV was killed on the battlefield, along with thousands of Scottish nobles. This battle broke Scottish strength for a generation, and gave England one of its most celebrated victories of the Tudor era. Though Henry was not physically present at Flodden, the victory added to his reputation. With Catherine's leadership and his general's success, His reign now seemed blessed with triumphs both in France and Scotland. England had asserted itself on two fronts. Henry's victories were followed by celebrations and displays of magnificence. Banquets, jousts, and masques filled the court. Foreign ambassadors marvelled at the wealth on display, the glittering costumes, and the king himself, who took pride in leading the festivities. The king's appetite for grandeur grew. Costly palaces were developed. Court entertainments expanded, and Henry spent freely to make his court rival those of France and Spain in magnificence. His jousting exploits became legendary. He was fearless, strong, and theatrical. Nobles admired his courage in the lists, and common people saw him as a hero. This extravagance carried costs. Henry's father, Henry VII, had been known for careful management of finances. Henry VIII, by contrast, drained wealth on war and display. Already in these early years, the tension between his ambition and England's limited resources appeared, but few people noticed at the time. For now, the public was captivated by a king who looked and acted like a hero. By the middle of his reign's first decade, Henry VIII had achieved what he wanted most. He was seen across Europe as a king of action. He was young, bold, victorious abroad, and celebrated at home. His enemies had been humbled in Scotland, and his victories in France added to his fame. The foreign rulers noticed, alliances shifted, and England appeared as more than a peripheral kingdom. It was a force led by a determined king, hungry for prestige. Henry VIII revelled in this image. He played the role of hero with enthusiasm, leading jousts in gleaming armour, composing songs, and presenting himself as the embodiment of Renaissance kingship. He was a warrior, a scholar, a performer, and above all a ruler determined to leave a name that would echo in every age. But beneath the triumphs and image-making, problems remained. England's victories in France were expensive and hard to maintain. The glory was real, but the substance was thin. Money was running short. The glow of triumph concealed cracks that would later widen into deeper struggles. For Henry VIII, however, the years of glory in France and Scotland, his jousts and feasts, and his image as a knightly monarch were everything he desired. He had shown the world that he was not content to sit quietly on the Tudor throne. He wanted greatness, and he was determined to chase it, no matter the cost. As the excitement of Henry VIII's early victories faded, attention shifted from his jousts and banquets to a problem much more serious: his dynasty. For all his dreams of glory abroad, the stability of the Tudor throne at home depended on one thing: the birth of a strong male heir. Without it, the dynasty his father had fought so hard to establish could collapse. Henry understood this. He believed his duty as king was not only to win battles but to secure the future of the dynasty by producing a son who could carry the Tudor line forward. England remembered the Wars of the Roses all too well, when a shortage of clear heirs had thrown the country into civil war. Henry knew the danger of leaving succession uncertain, and the pressure weighed heavily on him. Catherine of Aragon, Henry's queen, faced immense expectations. As the daughter of Spain's renowned monarchs, she had been trained for her role as a royal consort. She proved herself capable, devout, and supportive of her husband. But fate was unkind to her. Between 1509 and the 1520s, Catherine became pregnant many times. Sadly, most of those pregnancies ended in miscarriage or stillbirth. In 1510, she gave birth to a stillborn daughter. In 1511, a son was born but died within weeks. Over the years, more pregnancies ended in similar heartbreak. Each time, hope rose, only to collapse again. In 1516, Catherine finally gave birth to a surviving child, Princess Mary. While Mary's survival was a blessing, she was not the male heir Henry desperately wanted. To Henry, and to much of the nobility, daughters did not guarantee security. A woman on the throne, they believed, would threaten the peace, invite foreign influence, and open the door to civil conflict. Though Catherine continued to hope for another child, each passing year made it less likely. She was growing older, and her chances of bearing another healthy child diminished. For Henry, each lost child was not only personal grief but also political failure. He adored displays of strength and vitality, yet his household could not produce an heir to strengthen the dynasty. His frustration grew steadily, and while he still showed Catherine public respect, his dissatisfaction became harder to hide. By the mid-1520s, Catherine was in her 40s, Henry was in his prime, athletic and energetic, yet he looked at his marriage with increasing unease. He began to wonder whether God had cursed their union. To Henry, the lack of a son was not just misfortune, it was punishment. He convinced himself that he had broken a biblical law. Henry turned to Scripture for answers. His marriage to Catherine had always carried questions. Catherine had first been married to his brother Arthur. That marriage was said to have been unconsummated, and the Pope had granted a special dispensation allowing Henry to marry her. For years it seemed acceptable. But now, with no sons born alive, Henry began doubting the marriage's legitimacy. He found support for his doubts in the Bible, particularly in Leviticus 20:21, which stated that if a man marries his brother's wife, the union shall be childless. To Henry, this passage seemed to describe his own fate exactly. The king began to see his marriage not only as unlucky but cursed in the eyes of God. If true, then England's future was doomed unless the union was dissolved. This conviction grew into what Henry would later call his great matter. Catherine, for her part, refused to accept Henry's interpretation. She maintained firmly that her marriage with Arthur had never been consummated, and that Henry's marriage to her was valid before God and the law. Catherine's faith was unshakable. She saw her role as Henry's true wife and queen, and she would never admit otherwise. Years of miscarriages did not weaken her dignity. She continued to act as a dutiful queen, managing her household, supporting the court, and maintaining her devotions. But she could not give Henry what he longed for the most, a legitimate male heir. Beyond his personal frustrations, Henry also faced pressure from the nobility. Many lords worried that without a male Tudor heir, the kingdom would soon face uncertainty. Princess Mary, though intelligent and promising, was unlikely to unite the country. A woman's reign could be challenged, especially in a land where many remembered battles between rival heirs only decades earlier. Every lost child left England anxious. Every year without a son made the threat of instability grow larger. Whispers spread at court, and foreign observers noted the king's rising discontent. By the 1520s, it was not only the lack of an heir, but also Henry himself who pushed toward change. His character, once celebrated for charm and energy, was becoming more impatient. He could not stand the idea of being denied what he believed God had promised him as king. For Henry, the failure to produce a son was not Catherine's alone, but a reflection of divine displeasure. In this moment of doubt, everything Catherine represented, dutiful, Spanish, older, suddenly seemed like an obstacle to Henry's future. His mind turned dangerously toward escape. Could the marriage be annulled? Could the queen be set aside so that Henry might find a younger wife who could give him the son he needed? Despite Catherine's loyalty, Henry began to live divided between public devotion and private frustration. To the outside world, their marriage still appeared intact. But behind closed doors, Henry was withdrawing from her. His eyes wandered toward other women at court. His heart grew restless, caught between duty and desire for something new. This growing tension marked a turning point in Henry's reign. What had begun as a golden age of hope now faced shadows of uncertainty. The question of the heir hung over Henry's court like a storm cloud, shaping decisions, pushing him into conflict with allies, and leading him down a path that would alter English history forever. For Henry, the struggle for an heir was no longer only a family matter. It was the reason he believed God had placed him on the throne, and it was the problem he could not solve. Soon it would drive him to choices that shook the very foundation of the church, the monarchy, and Europe itself. The struggle for an heir overshadowed Henry's entire marriage with Catherine of Aragon, but it was the arrival of one woman, Anne Boleyn, that transformed the king's personal frustration into a full political and religious crisis. Anne did not enter Henry's life as a queen-to-be. She entered quietly, as a lady-in-waiting to Queen Catherine. Yet within a few years she captured the king's heart and ambition in a way that no one could have predicted. Anne Boleyn was not like other women at court. She had spent time in France, exposed to the refined culture of the European Renaissance. She was educated, witty, and elegant, possessing not just charm but a sharp intelligence. Dark-haired and striking rather than traditionally beautiful, she stood out in a court filled with fair-haired women. Her manner was confident, her conversation clever, and she understood the power of ambition. When Henry first noticed Anne, He was already restless and discontent with Catherine. Catherine had grown older, and her inability to provide a male heir weighed on him. But Anne did not behave like other women who caught the king's eye. She refused to become simply another royal mistress. She had seen what happened to women who gave themselves away too easily. Instead, Anne held back. She played a dangerous but deliberate game, encouraging Henry's interest but always keeping him at a distance. The more Anne resisted, the more Henry desired her. For a man used to commanding obedience, her refusal to yield only fueled his obsession. He wrote her letters expressing his passion and frustration. Anne remained cautious yet bold in her responses, feeding his longing while protecting her position. Slowly, she became more than a potential lover. She became the woman Henry imagined as his future queen. By the mid-1520s, Henry was convinced that his marriage to Catherine had to end. He believed his lack of a son was God's punishment, and that his union with Catherine was invalid from the beginning. Now, with Anne in his life, Henry had both motive and opportunity. If the Pope would annul his marriage, Henry could free himself from Catherine and marry Anne in the hope of securing the male heir he believed his dynasty required. The issue became known as the King's Great Matter. Henry instructed Cardinal Wolsey, his most powerful minister, to begin the legal proceedings to annul his marriage. Wolsey sought support from Rome, believing that Henry's claim had merit and that the Pope would be persuaded to side with England. But the situation grew complicated. The Pope, Clement VII, was caught in the grip of larger European politics. Catherine of Aragon was the aunt of Charles VIII, the Holy Roman Emperor and King of Spain, who was one of the most powerful rulers in Europe. Charles's armies had recently taken Rome, leaving the Pope effectively under his control. Granting Henry's annulment would anger Charles, and Clement could not risk provoking him. The Pope stalled, sending representatives to England, but refusing to make a clear decision. Meanwhile, Anne Boleyn's influence over Henry grew. She was bold in court, outspoken in her views, and supportive of reformist religious ideas that questioned the authority of Rome. Anne was not simply a private love affair. She was turning into a political force. Courtiers divided between those who supported Catherine, the long-serving queen, and those who saw opportunity in Anne's rise. The court became a place of whispers, factions, and rivalries. Henry's obsession deepened. What had begun as personal frustration became a national crisis. The king was no longer asking for permission to remarry, he was demanding it. His pride, his throne, his legacy, all seemed tied to winning this fight. Catherine, steadfast and dignified, refused to step aside. She would not accept that her marriage was invalid. She believed she was Henry's true wife before God and King, and nothing could force her to declare otherwise. This resistance inflamed Henry further. He grew impatient with Wolsey, blaming his minister for failing to deliver the annulment. The once powerful cardinal fell from favour, dismissed from office in disgrace. Thomas Wolsey's fall was a warning to all Henry VIII would not be denied. Anne's position became more and more central. Rumours spread that she encouraged Henry to break free from Rome entirely, that she and her allies inspired him toward independence. Whether Anne urged him directly or not, she became the symbol of change. Catherine represented duty, tradition, and obedience to Rome. Anne represented ambition, renewal, and the possibility of a son. By 1530, years had passed without resolution. The Pope continued to delay, Catherine refused to submit, and Henry's impatience exploded into anger. He began to surround himself with new advisors, men like Thomas Cromwell and Thomas Cranmer, who were willing to consider more radical solutions. They suggested that Henry did not need the Pope's approval to end his marriage. Instead, they argued England could handle its own spiritual matters. This was a revolutionary idea. It planted the seed of breaking from centuries of obedience to Rome. At first, this was not about pure religious reform for Henry. It was personal. He wanted Anne, he wanted a son, and he wanted freedom from the Pope's refusal to grant it. His desires were transforming into policy, and the kingdom itself was being drawn into the struggle. Anne now held a power almost unimaginable for a woman in Tudor England. She was not yet queen, but her influence drove decisions that changed the course of government and religion. She remained carefully out of scandal, insisting she would not give herself to Henry until they were married. For a king obsessed with honour and appearance, Anne's resistance forced him further into confrontation with Rome. To win her, he had to change the structure of authority in England. The longer the great matter dragged on, the more it divided the kingdom. Catherine had powerful support both at home and abroad. Many of the English people admired her deeply. She had served as queen for 2 decades, guided with wisdom, and acted as a true partner to Henry in rule. For many, replacing her was unthinkable, but others were drawn to the hope of change and to the charm of Anne Boleyn, who dazzled in court and promised the renewal of the dynasty through a new marriage. Henry's determination overpowered every obstacle. His charm from youth was giving way to impatience, temper, and ruthlessness. He no longer cared what reputation he risked. To him, the marriage to Catherine had to end, no matter what it cost. At the heart of this struggle, Anne's role remained decisive. Without her, Henry might have tolerated Catherine despite the lack of a son. Without her, he might not have fought so stubbornly with Rome. But Anne had become more than his desire. She was the symbol of what he believed God intended for him: a legitimate marriage, a legitimate son, and a new future for England. What began as the king's personal love affair had grown into a question of law, religion, and sovereignty. The Pope's refusal tied Henry's hands, but his pride would not allow surrender. Anne remained by his side, resisting until the marriage was certain. Henry pressed harder, his passion and desperation leading him toward decisions that would tear apart the very foundations of religious unity in Europe. The pursuit of Anne Boleyn was changing England. Soon it would break ties to Rome, unleash conflict, and crown a new queen whose fate would prove as dramatic as her rise. The woman who once entered court simply as a lady-in-waiting was now reshaping history itself. By the late 1520s, Henry VIII's longing to end his marriage with Catherine of Aragon had consumed him. What began as frustration over the lack of an heir had turned into a sharp conflict with Rome, one that would place king against pope, tradition against defiance, and transform England forever. Henry had spent years pressing Pope Clement VII for an annulment. His argument was simple. His marriage to Catherine was invalid because she had first been his brother Arthur's wife. He convinced himself that this marriage was against God's law, that England's lack of a male heir was divine punishment. But no matter how strongly he pressed the case, the Pope refused. The reasons were not personal. The Pope's position was chained by politics. Catherine was the aunt of Charles I, the powerful Holy Roman Emperor. In 1527, Charles's troops had even attacked Rome, leaving the Pope effectively his prisoner. Under such pressure, granting Henry's annulment was impossible. To anger Catherine's family was to risk war with Spain and the Empire, forces far greater than England. The Pope stalled, delayed, and sent envoys to hear Henry's case, but every move ended in hesitation. For Henry, the delays were intolerable. He had invested years into his great matter and surrounded himself with men who assured him his cause was just. Catherine continued to resist, refusing to admit her marriage was invalid. She would not go quietly, and in her steadfastness she won deep sympathy among the English people. Many saw her as a wronged queen, enduring her husband's rejection with dignity. Yet Henry's pride and obsession with Anne Boleyn only sharpened his resolve. He had promised Anne that they would be wed, that she would be queen, and that together they would secure the son England needed. By now, Anne had become more than a personal passion. She was the centre of Henry's new vision. If to marry her meant breaking with Rome, then Henry was willing to do it. The first casualty of the stalemate was Cardinal Wolsey. For years he had served as Henry's principal minister, managing wars, diplomacy, and the machinery of state. But Wolsey failed to deliver the annulment. In 1529, Henry dismissed him from office, and soon Wolsey was charged with treason. Before he could face trial, Wolsey died on his way to London. His fall marked a turning point. Henry no longer believed the Pope could or would help him. He now turned to new advisors, who were prepared to offer a radical solution. Thomas Cromwell and Thomas Cranmer rose in Wolsey's place. Both men were ambitious, skilled, and sympathetic to reformist ideas. They argued that Henry did not need papal approval. England could settle its own religious affairs, independent from Rome. This bold logic offered the king what he desired most: control. Henry listened. Slowly he shifted his belief from seeking permission to asserting authority. Anne Boleyn, too, encouraged his break from the Pope. Whether out of conviction or ambition, she and her supporters favoured reformist ideas that challenged papal supremacy. To her, Henry's cause was not only a fight for their marriage, but a chance to renew the Church in England, free of Rome's interference. Anne's influence on the king was greater than any woman's influence before her in English history. Courtiers now realised that to rise at court meant supporting Anne's cause, while opposing her meant risking the king's wrath. In 1532, Henry made Cranmer the Archbishop of Canterbury, ensuring a loyal ally in the highest church office of England. Cromwell, meanwhile, manoeuvred Parliament into passing laws that reduced papal authority and expanded the king's control over the church. These changes did not happen overnight, but gradually, through acts, debates, and decisions, England moved closer to declaring its independence from Rome. By 1533, Henry's patience had run out completely. He and Anne had been secretly married and she was already pregnant. This increased the urgency. If the baby were born outside of wedlock, it would be considered illegitimate and incapable of inheriting the throne. Henry could not risk another uncertainty in succession. He needed the marriage recognised, and he needed it quickly. Under Cranmer's authority, the English Church declared Henry's marriage to Catherine null and void. Soon after, Anne was formally crowned queen in a magnificent ceremony at Westminster Abbey. The break with Rome was now irreversible. Pope Clement then responded by excommunicating Henry, but the king no longer cared. He had taken England into a new era. This decision, driven by Henry's desire for Anne, was extraordinary in its consequences. For centuries, the Pope's authority had been unquestioned across Western Europe. Kings and emperors deferred to him in matters of marriage, law, and faith. By rejecting papal power, Henry VIII placed himself as head of a national church. It was not yet the full Protestant Reformation, but it was the beginning of religious independence. Politics, faith, and personal ambition were now intertwined. Henry believed he had done God's will, securing his throne through lawful marriage and ensuring the chance of a son. Anne, now queen, appeared radiant in her triumph. Catherine remained in England but was declared the Dowager Princess of Wales. She never accepted the annulment, and until her death she continued to declare herself Henry's only true wife. The people of England were divided. Some embraced the king's boldness, others resented the treatment of Catherine and feared the eternal consequences of defying the Pope. But resistance meant danger. Henry's will was law, and opposition to Anne's queenship was considered disloyalty. In these years, Henry took his most daring step as monarch. He had defied the might of Rome, elevated Anne, displaced Catherine, and altered the spiritual identity of his kingdom. What began as one man's determination to have a new wife had grown into a revolution that touched every part of English life. Land, law, politics, and faith were all reshaped because Henry wanted Anne Boleyn as his queen. Yet even as he celebrated, danger remained. Anne's crown was no guarantee of an heir. Her pregnancy held the kingdom's hopes, and Henry's future now depended once again on whether a child, and most importantly, a son, would be born to secure the Tudor throne. By 1533, Henry VIII had crossed a line no English king before him had dared to cross. He had rejected the Pope's authority, annulled his marriage with Catherine of Aragon, and married Anne Boleyn with the full expectation that she would give him the son he longed for. To secure his position, Henry elevated his loyal ally Thomas Cranmer to Archbishop of Canterbury, who promptly declared Catherine's marriage invalid and Anne's union with the king lawful. Rome and England were now formally divided, and in that divide lay the birth of a new institution, the Church of England. Henry's decision shook Europe. Clodoaldo VII had no choice but to issue excommunication, declaring that the King of England had placed himself outside the authority of the Catholic Church. To Catholic rulers across the continent, this was shocking. For centuries, the Pope's word had been final on matters of marriage and faith. Now Henry had declared himself above papal law and assumed powers traditionally reserved for the head of the universal church. But Henry was not interested in becoming a Protestant reformer, in the sense of Martin Luther or other voices challenging Catholic doctrine across Europe. Henry did not embrace sweeping theological change. His concern was political and personal. He wanted control over the English Church, so that no one, not the Pope, not the Emperor, not foreign powers, could interfere in his will. He wanted his marriage with Anne to be legitimate, their children to be secure heirs, and his dynasty to continue without the shadow of Rome. In June 1533, Anne Boleyn was crowned Queen of England in a lavish ceremony at Westminster Abbey. Never before had a royal mistress risen so high, and the spectacle was meant to show the world that Anne's triumph had the sanction of God and king alike. She appeared radiant, dazzling in her coronation robes, and Henry watched with pride. The crown represented not only the victory of his love, but the victory of his authority over Rome. Later that year, Anne gave birth to a daughter. On September 7, 1533, Princess Elizabeth was born at Greenwich Palace. The event was celebrated with full royal honours, though the king privately could not hide his disappointment that the baby was not the long-awaited son. Still, Henry accepted Elizabeth as legitimate, and placed great hope in the idea that more children would follow. He trusted Anne would soon provide the male heir he needed. Elizabeth's birth marked a turning point. In Catherine's place, Anne was now queen, raising her own household, controlling influence at court, and enjoying the full power that came with her crown. She was known for her sharp intelligence and her involvement in political affairs, speaking openly on matters of religion and policy. She favoured reformers and protected those who sought changes in the church. Her voice encouraged a new generation of thinkers who saw Henry's split from Rome not only as a political break, but as a chance for genuine religious transformation. Across England, however, divisions deepened. Many people admired Catherine of Aragon and believed she had been unfairly discarded. Priests who remained loyal to Rome spoke against the king's new marriage, while others embraced Henry's new authority. The country began to split between those who supported the reforms and those who resisted them. Henry responded with firmness. Parliament passed a series of acts that consolidated his power. The Act in Restraint of Appeals declared that England was no longer subject to foreign courts. No appeal could be made to the Pope. The Act of Supremacy in 1534 went further, declaring Henry the supreme head of the Church of England. From that moment, Henry and his heirs were not only kings but also supreme authorities in the spiritual life of their country. Anyone who defied this was guilty of treason. The shift was monumental. Lands owned by the monasteries, previously loyal to Rome, would gradually pass under royal control. Prayers for the Pope were silenced. All clergy were expected to swear an oath of loyalty, affirming the supremacy of the king over the church. Those who refused were punished harshly. Some imprisoned, others executed. Among those who resisted was Sir Thomas More, once Henry's loyal servant who refused to recognise Anne as queen and Henry as supreme head. His refusal cost him his life in 1535, a sobering signal that Henry's will would tolerate no dissent. Anne Boleyn, at the centre of this transformation, had become almost a queen unlike any other. Her rise created enemies everywhere. Those who had supported Catherine despised her, and even some supporters at court grumbled at her sharp manner and influence. Yet Henry defended her fiercely, convinced that she represented the future of his dynasty. But pressure remained. Anne had given birth to Elizabeth, but more than a year passed without another child. Henry grew restless and anxious again. His need for a male heir was unfulfilled. Anne, however, knew her power depended on producing that heir, and was determined to give Henry the son who would secure her place forever. Meanwhile, the wider consequences of breaking with Rome tested the kingdom. Catholic powers like Spain and France watched suspiciously, uncertain how to respond. Some feared that Henry's move might encourage other rulers to defy the Pope's authority. Others wondered if England had isolated itself from its allies. The future was uncertain, and enemies at home and abroad waited for Henry's bold experiment to fail. For Henry, none of it mattered in comparison to his immediate victory. He had proven himself stronger than the Pope, he had secured a new queen, and he had a daughter born of their marriage whom he recognised as legitimate. The Church of England was now his creation, and through it, his word became law in both secular and spiritual matters. In just a few years, Henry VIII had reshaped the very structure of English life. Power that once stretched from Rome to London was now cut, and authority rested firmly in the hands of the king alone. The birth of the Church of England had begun not from theological argument but from Henry's will, from his belief that neither Pope nor Church could deny him his desires. England's monarch had become master of both throne and altar, but the kingdom had not yet seen the storms this break would bring. Henry had hoped for resolution, yet what lay ahead was turbulence, resistance, and the constant fear that without a son, even his boldest act of defiance might collapse into failure. Anne Boleyn had achieved what no woman before her had managed. She had captured the heart of the king, forced him to defy the Pope, and risen from the ranks of a lady-in-waiting to the throne of England. Crowned queen in 1533, she seemed at the height of triumph. Yet even from this peak, danger surrounded her on every side. Her enemies were many, her supporters few, and her hold on Henry's heart rested entirely on one fragile hope, the birth of a son. When Anne gave birth to Elizabeth in September 1533, Henry showed pride but also disappointment. He had risked everything for her. He had cast aside his long-serving queen, alienated the Pope, split the church and created enemies across Europe. In return, he had expected the son that Catherine of Aragon could not give him. Instead, he had another daughter. Though Elizabeth was celebrated, Henry wanted more. He needed a boy, and each passing month added pressure on Anne to deliver. Anne's early months as queen were filled with confidence. She was outspoken, ambitious, and active in matters of politics and religion. She placed her family in high positions, promoted reformist clergy, and acted as though her influence was untouchable. Yet her boldness also created resentment. Many courtiers disliked her sharp tongue and feared the sway she held over the king. To Catherine's loyal supporters, she was a usurper who had stolen the crown. To others, she seemed arrogant, overreaching, and dangerous. Slowly, a faction of enemies began to form against her. Henry's frustration grew as Anne suffered a series of failed pregnancies. A miscarriage in 1534 disappointed him, but he gave her another chance. Another pregnancy ended in early 1536, around the time of Catherine of Aragon's death. The child, believed to have been a boy, was lost before birth. For Henry, this was devastating. He had justified everything: the break with Rome, the rejection of Catherine, the upheaval of the church on the promise of sons. Now Anne appeared unable to provide them either. Worse still, Anne's temper often made her quarrel with Henry. She was not meek or submissive like Catherine had been. Instead, she argued, challenged, and demanded. Henry, who was growing older and more irritable, did not respond well to Anne's confrontations. Their once passionate romance cooled as resentment grew between them. Henry began to look elsewhere, showing interest in other women at court. To Anne, this was both insulting and dangerous. She knew that her power depended on the king's affection. Without it, she might fall just as quickly as she had risen. By 1536, the relationship was strained to breaking point. Anne still had supporters, but her enemies were gathering strength. Among them was Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister. Once allied with Anne in creating the break from Rome, Cromwell had turned against her. They clashed over politics and influence, particularly over the distribution of wealth from the dissolution of monasteries. Cromwell began to see Anne not as an ally, but as a threat. His loyalty was to Henry, and when he judged that the king was tiring of Anne, he moved to destroy her. A plot began to take shape. Charges of adultery, treason, and even incest were prepared against Anne. Several men, including courtiers and musicians close to her, were accused of being her lovers. The evidence was weak, and much of it was fabricated. But in a court where the king's word was law, facts mattered less than Henry's willingness to believe. By this stage, Henry wanted freedom from Anne. Whether he truly believed she had betrayed him or simply wanted an excuse, he accepted Cromwell's case. In May 1536, Anne was arrested and taken to the Tower of London. For a queen who had once walked triumphantly into Westminster Abbey to be crowned, her arrival at the Tower was the beginning of the end. She was charged with committing adultery with 5 men, and even accused of plotting against the king's life. Among those charged was her own brother George Boleyn, accused of incest with his sister. These charges shocked even her enemies, but Anne's fate was already sealed. Her trial was conducted before a jury of peers, many of whom were eager to see her fall. Anne defended herself with dignity and denied every accusation with steadfastness. She spoke eloquently, insisting on her innocence, declaring her loyalty to the king and rejecting the monstrous claims made against her. But in Tudor England, when the king wished for a verdict, the jury could only deliver one answer. Anne was found guilty of treason. Henry wasted no time. All those accused alongside her were executed, including George Boleyn. On May 19, 1536, Anne Boleyn herself was led to Tower Green. Unlike Catherine, who had lived on in separation, Anne was to be destroyed publicly as a warning. She was granted the mercy of a swift execution by a French swordsman rather than the axe. Before the gathered crowd, Anne addressed those present calmly. She prayed for the king and accepted her death without bitterness. Then, kneeling, she received the blow that ended her life. She was 35 years old. Anne's downfall was as dramatic as her rise. From lady-in-waiting to Queen of England, from the centre of a revolution to a condemned prisoner, her journey lasted less than 10 years. Her death shocked England and Europe. For many she remained a villain, remembered as the temptress who caused the fall of Catherine of Aragon and the break with Rome. For others she was a tragic victim, destroyed by politics and a king's discontent. The consequences of Anne's fall were immediate. Within days, Henry VIII was betrothed to Jane Seymour, one of Anne's former ladies-in-waiting. The king wasted no time in moving on, as though Anne had been erased from memory. Elizabeth, her daughter, was declared illegitimate, stripped of her place in the succession. For Henry, Anne's existence, once the centre of his passion, had become a stain to be removed completely. Yet, history would remember her differently. Though she died disgraced, Anne Boleyn's influence lingered. The break with Rome, born of Henry's desire for her, had permanently reshaped England. The Church of England now stood independent. Her daughter Elizabeth, though pushed aside for now, would one day wear the crown and become one of England's greatest monarchs. Anne's personal tragedy laid the foundation for a future she could not have imagined. Henry VIII, however, felt no remorse. With Anne gone, he looked forward to a new marriage and the hope of a son. The cycle began again: ambition, desire, and the relentless search for an heir. Anne's life and death had shown how perilous it was to be the wife of Henry VIII. Queens could be crowned with splendour, only to be discarded or destroyed when they failed to give the king what he wanted most. Anne's fate revealed the darker side of Henry's rule. No longer the young and radiant prince of his early reign, he had become ruthless, willing to destroy anyone who stood in his way. The voices of opposition were silenced. Loyalty was tested by fear, and even queens were not safe from his wrath. England had entered a new phase, one marked not only by transformation of the church, but also by the shadow of terror in the court of Henry VIII. The fall of Anne Boleyn was not just the story of a queen undone by failed births or political enemies. It was the story of how far Henry was willing to go to secure his ambitions. If he could break from the Pope for Anne, he could just as easily execute her when she no longer suited his purpose. Anne had been the cause of revolution, yet in the end she was another victim of Henry's insatiable need for control and legacy. The blood of Anne Boleyn was barely dry when Henry VIII turned his attention to a new bride. Less than 2 weeks after Anne's execution in May 1536, Henry became engaged to Jane Seymour, one of Anne's former ladies-in-waiting. The speed of his decision shocked the court, but Henry did not pause. He was determined to move forward, convinced that Jane might finally give him the son he had longed for through 2 failed marriages. Jane Seymour was very different from both Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn. Where Catherine had been steadfast and dignified, and Anne bold and fiery, Jane was quiet, gentle, and submissive. Born into a noble but not especially powerful family, she was modest in manner and deeply pious. Her docile character was her greatest virtue in Henry's eyes. After the storms of Catherine's resistance and Anne's defiance, Jane's calm obedience seemed like welcome relief. She gave Henry what he now wanted most in a wife: not politics, not confrontation, but peace. On May 30th, 1536, just 11 days after Anne's execution, Henry and Jane were married. The court, still reeling from the Queen's trial and death, now had a new mistress to serve. Many who had despised Anne and remained loyal to Catherine saw the marriage as a chance for reconciliation. Jane reportedly begged Henry to restore Princess Mary, Catherine's daughter, to her rightful place. Though Henry only half agreed, Jane's intercession showed her desire to bring healing within the royal family. Henry treated Jane with great affection in the early days of their marriage. He honoured her family, gave her extravagant gifts, and displayed her proudly. But more than anything, he wanted her to succeed where Catherine and Anne had failed: the birth of a male heir. Jane's entire worth to Henry rested on this promise. She understood the danger of failure, for she had seen with her own eyes how swiftly queens could fall. For the first 2 years, Jane lived carefully, saying little, avoiding confrontation, and presenting herself as the loyal and dutiful consort. She did not attempt to dominate court politics or interfere with the king's decisions as Anne had. Where Anne had been admired and hated in equal measure, Jane drew neither fiery admiration nor resentment. She remained quiet, patient, and focused on her role as wife. In 1537, less than 18 months into her marriage, Jane gave Henry the news he had long prayed for. She was pregnant. The court erupted with relief, for the kingdom's future depended on her womb. Henry, now nearing middle age, was ecstatic. He ordered elaborate preparations for the birth and surrounded Jane with every possible comfort. This child, he was convinced, would be the answer to all his troubles. On October 12, 1537, Jane Seymour gave birth to a healthy son. The boy was christened Edward, and Henry's joy knew no limits. Bells rang across England, churches held services of thanksgiving, and celebrations swept the nation. For nearly 3 decades, the king had been haunted by the absence of a male heir. Now, at last, he had one. Edward, Prince of Wales, represented the secure continuation of the Tudor dynasty. Henry's pride and relief were overwhelming. He called Edward his most precious treasure, declaring that the boy was a gift from heaven. Jane was hailed as the perfect queen, the one who succeeded where Catherine and Anne had failed. Henry showered her with love and gratitude, convinced she was the wife destined to fulfill his greatest duty as king. For a brief moment, it seemed as if the turbulence of his reign had finally found peace. But the joy did not last. Jane's labour had been long and difficult. Just 12 days after giving birth, she fell gravely ill. Infection set in, and despite the efforts of physicians, her health deteriorated rapidly. On October 24, 1537, Queen Jane Seymour died at Hampton Court Palace. She was only 29 years old. Her death cast a dark shadow over Henry's triumph. The son he had craved was alive and healthy, but the queen who had given him that treasure was gone. For the first time in his life, Henry seemed genuinely heartbroken. Unlike Catherine, whom he had rejected, or Anne, whom he had condemned, Henry mourned Jane deeply. He wore black for months and avoided public festivities. Jane Seymour was buried with ceremony at St. George's Chapel in Windsor Castle. Later, she would be remembered as Henry's favourite wife, the one who gave him his only legitimate son. Years later, when Henry himself died, he was buried beside Jane, a final tribute to the woman he considered his true queen. The birth of Edward ensured the continuation of the Tudor line, but it did not resolve all uncertainty. The baby was weak and vulnerable, and England's political future still seemed fragile. Henry celebrated his triumph, but he also faced the reality of being a widower once more, now with 3 marriages behind him and 3 children of uncertain status. Mary, Catherine's daughter, remained declared illegitimate but alive. Elizabeth, Anne's daughter, was also removed from succession, and Edward, though legitimate, was still an infant. The dynasty still hung on fragile threads. Yet to Henry VIII, Jane Seymour's place in history was secure. She had done what no other wife could. In her death, she became an idealized figure in Henry's mind, pious, obedient, and successful in providing an heir. Unlike the 2 queens before, and the 3 queens still to come, Jane Seymour would escape Henry's wrath. In the end, she gave him what he wanted most, the son who ensured that the Tudors would endure, at least for 1 more generation. After Jane Seymour's death in 1537, Henry VIII entered a period of mourning, but his grief did not last forever. The king was now without a queen, and though he finally had a son in Edward, the boy was a fragile infant. Henry knew all too well the dangers of leaving his dynasty exposed. He was also politically vulnerable. England's break from Rome had made the kingdom a target, and enemies abroad waited for any chance to weaken him. Marriage once again became not only a personal matter, but a political necessity. By the late 1530s, Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister, was determined to strengthen England's hand through alliances. France and Spain, the 2 great Catholic powers, were natural threats. Cromwell looked instead to Protestant states in Germany, which had embraced reform and broken from the Pope. Securing ties with these states would place England firmly within a protective network against Catholic hostility. The House of Cleves, a duchy located in the Holy Roman Empire, became Cromwell's favoured choice. Duke Wilhelm of Cleves had two sisters, and one of them, Anne of Cleves, appeared to be a suitable bride for Henry. Anne had grown up in Germany with a modest and sheltered upbringing. Unlike Catherine or Anne Boleyn, she had little exposure to the refined courts of Europe. She did not speak English or Latin fluently, and her education was limited compared to Henry's other wives. But politically she represented a powerful Protestant alliance, and Cromwell pressed hard for the match. Henry hesitated. He had always valued beauty, wit and charm in his wives, but eventually he agreed to move forward. To finalize the decision, Henry requested a portrait. The king was deeply concerned about appearances, and he wanted to know what his potential bride looked like. Hans Holbein, the great court painter, was sent to paint Anne. The likeness he brought back was flattering. Henry approved the match, convinced she was an attractive and suitable woman. A treaty was signed and Anne was brought to England in late 1539. Henry, always romantic, insisted on meeting Anne before the formal ceremony. In January 1540, he disguised himself and rode to meet her at Rochester, but what he saw horrified him. In person, Anne did not meet his expectations. Whether the portrait had been too generous or Henry's standards too high, the king was immediately disappointed. He complained that she was not as beautiful as he had been led to believe, that her manners seemed provincial, and that she did not charm him as Catherine or Anne Boleyn once had. Despite his personal disappointment, the marriage was locked by treaty. Backing out would insult the Duke of Cleves and damage the fragile alliance Cromwell had worked so hard to secure. On January 6, 1540, Henry reluctantly married Anne of Cleves in a ceremony at Greenwich. The king, however, made little effort to hide his distaste. He referred to her privately as the Flanders mare, mocking her looks. The marriage quickly descended into disaster. Henry claimed he could not consummate the union, saying he found Anne unattractive. He mocked her in front of others and refused to treat her as a true wife. Anne, unfamiliar with English customs and the king's volatile personality, had little chance to win him over. Within weeks, Henry began to search for a way out. Cromwell, who had arranged the marriage, suddenly found himself in danger. The king's discontent was aimed directly at him, and enemies at court prepared to use this disaster as justification to destroy him. Meanwhile, Anne behaved with remarkable dignity. She was confused by Henry's rejection but offered no resistance when told their marriage would be annulled. She declared that she wished only to please the king and agreed to the annulment swiftly. In July 1540, after just 6 months, Henry's marriage to Anne of Cleves was declared void on the grounds that it had never been consummated. Rather than punish Anne, Henry treated her generously. He granted her estates, wealth, and the title of the king's sister. Allowing her to live comfortably in England, she retained respect at court, avoided the suspicion that had doomed Anne Boleyn, and survived Henry, something not all queens could boast. The annulment left Henry free to pursue a new bride, but the scandal destroyed Cromwell. Once the king's most trusted advisor, Cromwell was accused of treason and executed in July 1540. His enemies, particularly those opposed to his religious reforms, used the failed marriage as proof of his failure. Thus, Anne of Cleves' brief role as queen brought about the fall of one of Henry's most powerful ministers. Though Anne's marriage to Henry was a humiliation, she outlived him and all of his other wives. She remained in England quietly, respected as the king's sister, and kept her head while others around Henry lost theirs. In the end, she was one of the fortunate few who became close to Henry VIII and emerged relatively unharmed. The episode revealed much about Henry himself. By 1540, he was no longer the dazzling prince of his youth. He had grown heavier, suffered from leg ulcers, and was prone to violent moods. His vanity, however, had not diminished. He still demanded beauty, obedience, and submission from his wives. Anne of Cleves, though harmless and agreeable, never had a chance to meet those impossible expectations. To Henry, she was a reminder of his fading charms and a marriage that had embarrassed him before Europe. Within days of his annulment, Henry fixed his eyes on another young woman, Catherine Howard. The cycle of desire, marriage, and danger would begin once more, and this time, the outcome would be bloody. Henry VIII's marriage to Anne of Cleves had ended almost before it began, leaving the king humiliated but free. In the ruins of Cromwell's political disaster, Henry found renewed excitement in a young woman who seemed to promise him a new beginning. Her name was Catherine Howard, and like Anne Boleyn, she was part of the powerful Howard family. Unlike Anne, Catherine was much younger, livelier, and willing to treat Henry as the glorious king he still yearned to be. Catherine Howard entered Henry's life at a moment when he felt old, tired, and insecure. By 1540, he was nearly 50 years old, suffering from obesity and painful leg ulcers. The handsome, athletic prince of his youth was gone, and his exploding temper often frightened those around him. Yet Catherine, barely in her late teens, flattered him, danced for him, and treated him as though he remains the splendid monarch of earlier years. For a man clinging desperately to his fading glory, Catherine represented joy, youth, and vitality. Their marriage took place in July 1540, only weeks after Henry annulled his marriage to Anne of Cleves. The speed of the wedding revealed just how infatuated Henry had become. He showered Catherine with jewels, dresses, and attention. He called her his rose without a thorn, a romantic phrase that revealed the depth of his obsession. At court, Catherine's family celebrated her rise. The Howards had once been elevated by Anne Boleyn, and now another Howard girl had reached the throne. The girl herself seemed pleased to enjoy the luxuries of being queen. Catherine loved dancing, music, and the pleasures of court life. She was friendly, cheerful, and beloved by Henry, who seemed revitalized by her presence. But the differences between Henry and Catherine were stark. The king was in failing health, moody and suspicious. Catherine was a teenager, hungry for pleasure and attention. She had grown up in the household of the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, where supervision was loose and scandals sometimes erupted. In her youth, Catherine had already engaged in flirtations and intimacies with men. Her past was known to some, but it was carefully hidden from Henry, who was desperate to believe his young queen was pure and devoted only to him. The truth, however, began to surface. While Queen Catherine showed too much familiarity with younger men at court, among them was Thomas Culpeper, a gentleman of the king's chamber. Rumours spread that they shared secret meetings, and whispers grew louder with each passing month. Whether Catherine had truly committed adultery or was merely rash in her behaviour, the accusations carried deadly weight. Henry's queens were expected to embody perfect virtue. Even the suggestion of betrayal threatened the king's honour and security. Those who disliked the Howard influence took careful note of Catherine's actions. In late 1541, evidence of her past and present indiscretions reached Archbishop Cranmer. Shocked, Cranmer hesitated to inform the king directly, knowing Henry's violent temper, but eventually he revealed the allegations in a letter, leaving Henry to consider the charges in private. The king's reaction was explosive. At first, Henry refused to believe his rose without a thorn could betray him. He wept in public, declaring that he could not imagine Catherine guilty of such dishonour. But once evidence was presented, testimonies of her past lovers and intercepted letters, his affection collapsed into rage. Catherine was placed under house arrest, questioned, and eventually imprisoned in the Tower of London. Henry was crushed, humiliated once more by a queen who had failed him. His dream of youth renewed and glory restored had turned into another nightmare. The aging king, struggling to walk and consumed by illness, had convinced himself that Catherine's betrayal was a final insult to his manhood. He could not forgive her, just as he had not forgiven Anne Boleyn years before. The charges against Catherine grew into a formal case of treason. The culprit and another former lover, Francis Darayam, were executed brutally. Catherine, meanwhile, was condemned by Parliament without a formal trial. She was declared guilty of betraying the king's trust, and her execution was ordered. On February 13, 1542, Catherine Howard was led to the scaffold on Tower Green, the same place where Anne Boleyn had died only 6 years earlier. Barely a teenager when she first caught Henry's attention, Catherine was now no older than 21. Before the crowd, she confessed her sins and prayed for the king. Kneeling, she was beheaded quickly by the executioner's axe. Catherine's short reign as queen had lasted less than 2 years. In death, she joined the growing list of Henry's wives who had been cast aside or destroyed. Her story reflected the tragic danger of life in the Tudor court, where one moment of favour could be followed swiftly by downfall and execution. For Henry VIII, Catherine Howard's betrayal left deep scars. It reminded him that he was old, no longer the vigorous prince who once captivated Europe. He raged at her memory, but the truth was harder to face. He was no longer the man Catherine pretended him to be. His search for youth and passion had only led him to humiliation, and his kingdom watched as yet another queen was brought low by the king's relentless desires. The pattern was becoming unmistakable. Henry VIII's pursuit of heirs and his volatile nature meant that any wife who disappointed him faced the risk of ruin. Catherine's death, coming after years of turbulence, reinforced the sense that Henry's court was a place of fear, where ambition and affection could swiftly turn into betrayal and bloodshed. Those who served him understood now more than ever that one man's moods dictated the fate of queens, nobles, and the whole nation. As the axe fell on Catherine Howard, Henry's personal story of love and marriage grew darker. He had destroyed 2 queens through execution, set aside 2 others, and lost one to death in childbirth. Only women who brought him obedience or sons could survive his reign. The trials of Catherine Howard revealed a king increasingly ruled by anger, insecurity, and vengeance, a monarch who could inspire loyalty but also terror. And yet, despite his grief and fury, Henry was not finished with marriage. His health was failing, his body weakened, but he still longed for companionship, stability, and an heir secure enough to protect his legacy. Soon he would marry again, this time to a woman who would prove more cautious, more patient, and more enduring than the rest. By the time Henry VIII lost Catherine Howard to the executioner's axe in 1542, the king was a broken man in many ways. He was older, heavier, and plagued by constant pain from his ulcers. His temper grew worse with each passing year, and the fear he inspired at court hung over everyone. Yet still he remained king, and still he sought the companionship of a queen. This final marriage would not be fueled by passion or ambition alone, but by the need for stability and honest care. The woman who would provide it was Catherine Parr. Catherine Parr was unlike Henry's previous wives. Born in 1512, she was well-educated, intelligent, and composed. She had lived through 2 marriages already, both to older men, and had been left widowed twice before meeting Henry. She was known for her piety, her sharp mind, and her ability to navigate difficult households. These qualities, though subtle, made her an ideal partner for a king whose health and temperament required patience and diplomacy. Catherine was not chosen for her beauty or youth. By the time she married Henry in July 1543, she was 31 years old, a mature woman compared to Catherine Howard, whose youth and recklessness had destroyed her. Instead, Henry sought in Catherine Parr a wife who could bring him companionship, steadiness, and loyalty. He needed someone who could act not just as a queen, but as a caretaker. The marriage proved to be different from all those before it. Catherine Parr treated Henry with respect, ministered to his illnesses, and soothed his temper when it raged. She played the role of nurse and companion as much as wife, which suited Henry's fragile condition, yet she was no mere servant. She was a capable woman who used her position to wield quiet influence. She maintained order in the royal household, encouraged Henry's children, and supported reformist ideas in religion. Catherine was particularly devoted to uniting Henry's fractured family. By now, Mary and Elizabeth had both been declared illegitimate after the disgrace of their mothers. Edward, Henry's only son, was the obvious heir, but was still a delicate child. Catherine pushed Henry to reconcile with his daughters and to restore their standing. Through her patience and persuasion, Henry softened. In 1543, the Third Succession Act was passed, which restored both Mary and Elizabeth to the line of succession after Edward. It was an extraordinary achievement and one that ensured the survival of the Tudor dynasty after Henry's death. The Queen also served as regent in Henry's absence. When he left for a campaign in France in 1544, Catherine was appointed to govern in his place. She carried out her duties with skill, handling finances, correspondence, and matters of state. Few queens before her had been trusted with such responsibility, and she proved equal to the task. Her intelligence and steadiness earned her respect from courtiers who had once dismissed her as merely a caretaker queen. Catherine Parr was deeply religious and embraced reformist ideas. She encouraged the translation of the Bible into English, and supported scholars who sought to promote new interpretations of faith. She even wrote 2 books of her own, making her the first Queen of England to publish under her own name. Yet these religious beliefs also placed her in danger. Conservative factions at court, still loyal to Catholic traditions, saw her reformist leanings as a threat. In 1546, her enemies tried to convince Henry that she was a heretic. For a moment her life stood on the edge as an arrest warrant was drawn up, but Catherine, quick-witted and diplomatic, managed to save herself. She approached Henry, claiming that her discussions about religion were not arguments but merely ways to distract him from his physical pain and to learn from his wisdom. Her humility flattered him, and the king relented. The danger passed, and Catherine once again proved her ability to survive in a court where so many others had fallen. Despite his failing health, Henry found in Catherine Parr a queen who brought him comfort and stability. She did not try to dominate him like Anne Boleyn, nor did she remain distant as Catherine of Aragon often had in later years. She managed to strike a delicate balance, devoted and obedient but intelligent and resourceful. Even when she faced threats, she showed resilience. Meanwhile, her influence on Henry's children was lasting. She cared deeply for Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward, and gave them a household filled with learning and faith. Elizabeth especially benefited from Catherine's encouragement. The young princess absorbed not only her stepmother's religious interests, but also her example of intelligence and strength. Decades later, when Elizabeth herself became queen, she carried with her many of the lessons she had seen in Catherine Parr. Catherine's marriage to Henry lasted until his death in January 1547. Unlike four of his previous wives, she did not face rejection, annulment, or execution. Instead, she survived him, becoming the only one of his queens to outlive the king. At Henry's funeral, she was not present, but her survival alone marked her as unique among the women who had shared his throne. After Henry's death, Catherine continued her life independently. She married again, this time for love, choosing Thomas Seymour, the brother of Henry's third wife and uncle to the young King Edward VI. But her final years were short. She died in 1548 at the age of 36, only a year into her marriage to Seymour, and shortly after giving birth to a daughter. Catherine Parr's legacy was not dramatic like Anne Boleyn's, nor tragic like Catherine Howard's. Her achievement was survival. She brought Henry peace in his final years, held the throne with dignity, helped ensure the succession of his children, and encouraged religious reform. Unlike the others, she avoided destruction in a reign where queens so often fell. For Henry, she was the last companion of his stormy marital life. For history, she was the survivor, the woman who outlived a king whose marriages had reshaped England forever. As Henry VIII grew older, his rule became darker and more fearful. The young golden prince who once dazzled Europe with his energy and charm was long gone. In his place stood a king plagued by obesity, disease, and paranoia. The cheer of the early reign had vanished, replaced by fear, executions, and a court dominated by factions constantly fighting for influence. Henry's lust for power had always been clear, but in these later years it became absolute, ruthless, and unforgiving. The break with Rome had given Henry immense control over both church and state. No longer bound by the Pope, he declared himself supreme head of the Church of England, making his word the highest authority in both spiritual and political life. But maintaining this authority required crushing resistance. Anyone who questioned his supremacy was a traitor, and in Henry's England, treason was punished with death. Prominent figures who had once been close to him fell victim. Sir Thomas More, who had served as Lord Chancellor and refused to recognise Anne Boleyn as Queen, had already been executed in 1535. In the years that followed, Henry continued this practice of dealing with dissent harshly. Thomas Cromwell, who had orchestrated so much of Henry's split from Rome and built his supremacy in law, became another casualty. Cromwell's role in engineering the disastrous marriage with Anne of Cleves left him exposed, and his enemies at court convinced Henry of his treason. In 1540, Cromwell was arrested and executed, the same day Henry married Catherine Howard. The fall of Cromwell showed once again that no man, however useful, could rely on Henry's favour for long. Henry's power also reshaped the land of England itself. Through the dissolution of the monasteries, the king seized vast church properties, gaining immense wealth and redistributing lands among his supporters. Monasteries that had stood for centuries as centres of piety, learning and charity were stripped, their treasures taken for the crown, their lands handed to nobles loyal to the king. This transformation expanded royal power, but also caused resentment among those who saw an ancient way of life being destroyed. Yet few dared to protest openly. The message was clear: in Henry's England, survival meant obedience. As his body grew weaker, Henry's suspicion of betrayal grew stronger. He was haunted by the idea that those closest to him might turn against him. Nobles, advisors, and even wives found themselves under scrutiny. Entire families could be destroyed by accusations of treason, often based on little more than rumor or political maneuvering. Executions became spectacles of terror designed to remind everyone that the king's authority was absolute. The atmosphere at court was tense and uncertain. Factions fought for influence around the king, each seeking to shape policy and secure their own power, but all lived in fear of Henry's sudden wrath. One day a family could rise to greatness, and the next it could be ruined, its leaders chained in the Tower of London. This constant instability reflected Henry's moods, which were increasingly violent and unpredictable. The king's health played no small role in this transformation. By the 1540s, Henry was grossly overweight, uninterested in the athletic pursuits of his youth. He suffered from chronic leg ulcers that pained him terribly and left him irritable, immobile, and often in foul temper. Tormented by pain, haunted by betrayal, and desperate to maintain strength in his declining years, Henry ruled with brutality. Perhaps nothing demonstrated Henry's power more clearly than the fates of his own wives. He had divorced Catherine of Aragon, executed Anne Boleyn, lost Jane Seymour to death in childbirth, annulled Anne of Cleves, executed Catherine Howard, and finally settled with Catherine Parr. Each marriage displayed his personal desires, but also his authority to reshape lives and laws as he wished. A queen could be crowned one year and condemned the next. Few better symbols existed of Henry's dominance over both love and law. Even as his health worsened, Henry did not relinquish control. He continued to wage war abroad, particularly against France and Scotland, though the campaigns were costly and achieved little lasting success. At home, he spent extravagantly on palaces, pageantry, and displays of power, leaving England financially strained. But his pride could not bear to appear weak. He demanded to be seen as a powerful monarch until the very end. Court life mirrored the king's decline. Flatterers and opportunists flourished, telling Henry what he wanted to hear in the hope of avoiding his anger. Fear silenced opposition, and even trusted servants lived carefully, never certain when the king's suspicion might fall on them. The executions of nobles and courtiers sent continual warnings. The once vibrant crown of England had become a shadowed court, where survival demanded silence and loyalty to a mercurial master. Henry's reign in these final years was remembered not only for his tyranny, but also for the permanent changes he had made to England's identity. With the church firmly under royal authority, the grip of the Pope was broken, never to fully return. Nobility had grown tied to the crown through grants of monastic land, securing a loyalty based on wealth taken from the church. A strong centralized monarchy had emerged, ruthless, feared, and unchallengeable. Yet behind the grandeur of royal power was a man broken by the weight of his own choices. Henry had gained what he had long sought in Edward, his young son and heir, but his daughters Mary and Elizabeth remained reminders of failed marriages and lost hopes. His body was failing, his temper burning brighter, and his kingdom walking the line between stability and fear. To the outside eye, he was still king of one of Europe's proudest realms, but to those closest to him, Henry VIII was no longer the vibrant monarch who once dazzled courtiers and foreign ambassadors. He was a man consumed by suspicion, violence, and the terror he inspired in others. The reign that had begun with such promise of light and glory was now steeped in shadows of blood and fear. Henry VIII had become the very definition of absolute monarchy, where the will of one man reached into every corner of law, church, and society. Those who lived through it knew that favour was fleeting, security an illusion, and death always near for those who displeased the king. By the mid-1540s, Henry VIII was a shadow of the young prince who had once dazzled Europe with his charm and vitality. Decades of excess, injuries, and illness had left his body broken. He weighed well over 400 pounds, his once athletic frame reduced to immobility. Painful leg ulcers tormented him, oozing constantly and leaving him foul-tempered. He could no longer ride as he once had, nor compete in tournaments. Even walking was a struggle, and he had to be carried around in specially constructed chairs. The vibrant image of the golden monarch had faded, replaced with the sight of a king aged before his time. His temper, already notorious, grew worse as his health declined. Those around him lived in fear of his outbursts. A word spoken wrongly could mean ruin. A hint of disloyalty could bring charges of treason. His paranoia deepened and suspicion fell even upon men who had served him loyally for years. Friends of his youth were long dead, many executed on his command. Only flatterers and cautious courtiers remained, carefully managing the moods of a dying tyrant. The atmosphere of fear at court was suffocating. Despite his failing health, Henry clung tightly to power. He involved himself in affairs of state, issuing orders, directing wars and demanding loyalty. He fought campaigns against France and Scotland, though with limited results. The military ventures drained England's treasury and left little permanent gain, but Henry could not abandon his desire to appear powerful before his rivals. Even as his body betrayed him, he insisted on projecting strength. At home, the struggle for power shifted around him. With his death approaching, factions at court fought to secure influence over his heir, the young Edward. Reformers and conservatives vied for dominance, knowing the boy's future government would shape England's destiny. Each side sought to control Henry's favour in his final days, manipulating his moods and words to prepare for life after his reign. The wives who had defined so much of his reign were mostly gone. Catherine of Aragon had died years before. Anne Boleyn had been executed. Jane Seymour had died after childbirth. Anne of Cleves lived quietly in England as his sister, and Catherine Howard had been put to death for alleged adultery. Only Catherine Parr remained, his sixth and final wife. She cared for him with patience and intelligence, soothing his temper, managing his household, and ensuring his children were provided for. Catherine Parr's presence gave Henry stability, but even she lived cautiously, always aware of the danger of falling from his favour. In these last years, Henry faced his own mortality more often than he admitted. He was haunted by his lack of strong adult heirs. Edward was his greatest treasure, but the boy was young and frail. Mary and Elizabeth had been restored to the succession, yet both had been declared illegitimate earlier in life. Henry knew too well how fragile dynasties could be, for he had inherited his crown through conflict, and the Wars of the Roses were still a fresh memory in England's collective mind. The thought of unrest after his death troubled him deeply. As illness grew worse, Henry's counsellors prepared for the inevitable. In December 1546, his condition deteriorated further, and by January 1547 he was close to death. In his final days, he was surrounded by his closest attendants, who struggled to deal with a king both physically helpless and still terrifying in his commands. His will, carefully prepared, confirmed Edward as his heir, with Mary and Elizabeth following in line. This act ensured that all three of his children would one day wear the crown, though Henry himself could not imagine how unpredictable their reigns would be. When asked if he wished to see a priest one last time, Henry hesitated, then demanded one be brought to him. Cranmer, his Archbishop of Canterbury, came to his bedside. By then, Henry could no longer speak clearly. As Cranmer urged him to put his faith in Christ, Henry managed only to squeeze his hand, his final gesture of belief. On January 28, 1547, Henry VIII died at Whitehall Palace. He was 55 years old. His death marked the end of an era, yet for many it came as a relief. England had lived for decades under his volatile rule, and though he had brought stability in some ways, his reign was also marked by executions, fear, and destruction. Few mourned him with genuine affection. His son Edward was proclaimed king immediately, though the boy was only 9 years old and control of the kingdom fell to powerful nobles who sidestepped the balance Henry had tried to maintain. Henry was buried alongside Jane Seymour at St. George's Chapel, Windsor, as he had requested. In his mind, Jane had been his true queen, the only wife who gave him the son he longed for. The decision reflected how deeply his legacy was tied to his obsession with heirs, a pursuit that had driven so many of his choices. The final years of Henry VIII revealed the stark transformation of the man. He had risen as a brilliant, athletic young prince celebrated across Europe, but he died as a bloated, suspicious tyrant feared by his court. His quest for legacy had left England changed forever. The power of the Pope was gone. The monasteries were dissolved. The monarchy had grown stronger, yet also more ruthless. He had secured a son, but the future of the dynasty remained uncertain. Those who lived through his final years remembered a king who could no longer inspire joy, only fear. His court was a place of tension, where even the highest nobles quaked at the possibility of his anger, yet none could deny his impact. Henry VIII had carved England into a different shape, preparing the stage for upheavals that his children. The story of his final days was not one of peace, but of looming questions. Would Edward survive and rule strongly? Would Mary or Elizabeth one day claim the crown? Would England remain united under the church Henry had created? These uncertainties lingered as the great Tudor king was lowered into his grave. His shadow extended far beyond his lifetime, leaving behind both fear and transformation. And so the life of King Henry VIII comes to an end, a story of triumph and tragedy, of power and fear, of a king who changed England forever. From the hopeful young prince to the feared and aging ruler, Henry's choices left a mark that no one could erase. His 6 marriages, his bold defiance of the Pope, and his relentless search for an heir reshaped not just his dynasty, but the very faith and future of his kingdom. Edward, Mary, and Elizabeth would each inherit a crown weighed down by his decisions, and together their reigns would carry forward the enormous legacy of the Tudor name. History remembers Henry as both hero and tyrant, a man of charm and destruction, glory and cruelty. Yet his story teaches us about ambition, the human desire for legacy, and the cost that comes when power demands everything. If you found this journey through Henry VIII's life meaningful or learned something new, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and share it with others who love history. Thank you for staying with us until the very end. For now, we say good night, and may your dreams be peaceful. Good night.